Hello. In the past video, we looked at event sources, adding event sources to Godspeed, and we discussed very briefly about events. Let me just take you quickly through the same thing again. So, like we discussed in last video, functions or workflows or a business logic within any service, monolith, full stack app, microservice, or a serverless function are always triggered via an event. An event could come through an API like REST, gRPC, GraphQL, SOAP API, or it could come from a message bus, a WebSocket. It could be a Salesforce event, which is again an async event, a cron job, so on and so forth. And these events are triggered via different mechanisms to different event sources installed in your project, like Express Server, GraphQL, Apollo GraphQL Server, Fastify Server, look on the left side, so on and so forth, which are configured within your project. Like this is an Express event source. Okay. Now, when you set up event source, there are some default configuration set up for all your events for that event source. For example, all Express events API calls basically routed through Express will have this authentication and authorization logic applied to all of them. Unless you change this default behavior, this will be applicable to every event. You can override this at the event level, which we'll see today in the video. Then even your request and response validation error is an event source level default setting, which can again be overridden at the event level. Log attributes can also be added to the event level to further add some more key value bindings in the logs printed when that event is executed to help you do better debugging on your local host or on production environment. This is Swagger specific configuration. You do not need to set up Swagger info and servers in events. This is set up only in event source. But if you disable authentication on your events, then your Swagger will not have the JWT security enabled for that particular event and hence your Postman collection also. So this is getting started with event sources. Once you have set up your event source, so in this project, we have Express, GraphQL, Kafka, and Salesforce. Let us focus on the first three for the sake of this project, Express, GraphQL, and Kafka, and see how they work together. Fastify event source is same as Express in configuration and everything else. You can just have an out-of-box replacement of Express with Fastify without changing a single line of code in your project by just creating a Fastify plugin in your event source, adding it through Godspeed plugin add command, which I showed earlier, and then going to http.yaml and changing type express to Fastify. That's it. Everything else should remain same in your project. Now here coming to events, right? So once your event sources are set up, you define all your events in the events folder. These are events listening on all different event sources. For example, health check is listening on HTTP. DB sync Kafka to DB is listening on Kafka event source. Similarly, this is a CRUD API generated for by Godspeed automatically for loan application and user from a Prisma data source, which we will lending service db.prisma as user and loan application. We just use Godspeed generate command CRUD API command to generate these CRUD endpoints like getting one by ID, create, update, delete. And as you see, these events are listening on both HTTP and GraphQL. This is a get query, and this is the URL. This is the path param ID inserted here. All the params and the responses schema is also defined. I will come to that later. But like in the previous video we discussed, whenever you create an event for a particular event source, only your first line changes depending on the event source. Rest of the schema across events from any event source is same. This is the decoupled and modular behavior of configuring events in Godspeed. Further, we follow two very important concepts which every team in the world must follow, called schema driven development and single source of truth, which we'll look into this video and as well is covered very nicely in a blog on our Godspeed blog. called schema-driven development, the first guardrail. Okay, this is a first class citizen of Godspeed. We will investigate further into this in this video. Now, once you have created events in this folder, all of these events will be loaded during runtime. Your Swagger spec will be generated. You can further run a command, okay, called gen GraphQL schema in case of GraphQL, and generate your GraphQL schema also from these events. You see, all your same event definition following single source of truth paradigm. Okay, these event CRUD API has been exported to a GraphQL schema also. Rest of your project is same for both Express and GraphQL. You have the same event definitions here. Okay, both are reusing the same event definitions. It could even be a third event source, GraphQL, and maybe if you run HTTP2 and GraphQL2, tomorrow you may even expose this in another mechanism. So all of them, just put ampersand, and same event definition can be shared across multiple event sources. So their schemas like GraphQL schema, Swagger schema is automatically generated for you from a single source of truth and schema driven development paradigm. This is your main schema, single source of truth. From here, you run both your Swagger spec. Here is your Swagger spec of the entire project, which was generated for you. Even your definitions have been generated for you. Okay. Everything has been generated. Now you don't need to send emails. Creating Postman collections by hand, Swagger spec by hand, and updating them by hand whenever your API changes. You should not manually do these things. You should automatically generate your Swagger spec from your event definitions. This is single source of truth, your event definition. Okay. Even your GraphQL API. See, it has been generated. Your two fetch queries. And if you go to root, all your mutations have been generated for you. Everything has been generated. Okay, this is single source of truth. This is the beauty of this design principle, schema driven development with single source of truth. So once you have done this, you are now benefiting from exposing same events, same definitions, okay, and also same functions. Basically the functions that these events invoke, right? Whenever you call an event, so it invokes a function, no, your event handler, this fn. Here, if you see, I'm listening on this Kafka event, this topic, and this group ID. I'm calling this function db sync.kafka to db. It's in my functions folder. Functions db sync kafka to db. Here you are seeing a YAML workflow basically. Okay. If you're new to YAML, don't worry. In Godspeed, you're not limited to using YAML. But once you get comfortable with YAML, sometimes you may just prefer this because the code does much more while having least boilerplate of the additional things that you need to do. Okay, but just if let's say you want to use TypeScript, you are free to use TypeScript in Godspeed also. For example, here in this CRUD API, same CRUD API is also written by TypeScript. Here is my TypeScript code how to run this. Okay, I'm getting Prisma client, data source.lendingservicedb.client. Okay, I'm calling Prisma API and I'm returning my response. Okay, so this is TypeScript code also. You can even return response simply as this or as a GS status, Godspeed status, a standard that we have defined for Godspeed. As you notice, your response in this TypeScript or YAML functions has nothing to do with Express server, Fastify server, Apollo GraphQL server, anything of your event source. It's decoupled from your event source. If you noticed, right? It's a pure function. It takes an input and it returns an output. Here is your status code, and this is your data. This is your message. This is your success status, true or false. And any custom headers that you want to set, you are setting your headers for your response here. That's all, which could be done in this way as well. It's the same thing as above. Okay. You could even skip all of these things. If you know that your code is 200, success is true, just return your data. In that case, you'll simply return res. For example, in one, when you get one out here, 200, one by ID, right? I'm finding using loan application dot find unique where ID is this params dot ID, no? So instead of returning this new GS status, I could even say return res. In this case, Godspeed will simply add 200 status code. That's it. Because we are not setting any custom headers. So this should just work. All right. So this was about function handler of your event, no? So this is the function being called for any event source. Now this is standard across all events, defined for all event sources. Check out any other event like health check. Here also I'm simply writing the same way. This will go to Swagger. This will be your event handler, which is a TypeScript function, check underscore TS here. Health, check underscore TS. Okay, whatever logging I'm doing, and then I'm returning whatever I'm returning. This is my computation, right? So this is basically invoking your FN handler from your event sources. Then we saw authentication and authorization. You remember in event sources, setting up authentication and authorization on your event sources. It could be JWT, which is already supported by Express, Fastify, GraphQL. You can add OAuth 2 also. For that, today Godspeed plugins of Express Fastify don't support OAuth 2, but it is very easy to do it to customize your Express plugin. We will see in the next video how to customize your event source. For now, whenever you set authentication and authorization in your event source, which we just saw initially, here HTTP Express, I said JWT authentication, it an authorization. Now this means every single API call to this Express server will have to go through authentication and authorization. But if you want to disable authentication and authorization for any particular endpoint, any event, then you say authn is false and it will not be applied on that event. So authentication is always handled within the event source code as a middleware of Express Fastify. Our plugins already doing it for JWT. You can do it for OAuth 2 also, or any other authentication mechanism. Okay. And then configure that setup within your YAML file configuration of that event source. Authorization may now vary across event to event. For example, API call 1 allows role to be manager, but API call 2 requires role to be admin, right? So then you may want to set up a custom authorization for that particular API too. So all your APIs are role manager by default. If we go to HTTP, let us see. I'm checking role manager or role admin. Okay, role admin or manager by default in these two, right? There could be a third role called owner or any other kind of authorization, any other kind of attribute based access control or role based access control that you want to apply on this particular event, okay, that you can put in this function also and specify a function for authorization, which could be a TypeScript or a YAML workflow in Godspeed way of doing things, okay. So here we are calling authz.customauthz. Check out the functions folder. There's a auth.customauthz.ts. All right. Here, just for example's sake, I'm not doing any computation that who's this user, which IP address they come from, what's the time of the day, which country are they from. Those are attribute based access control or role based. I'm not checking it. Very simply, I'm just denying access right now. Okay. You just need to say success is false. That means authorization has failed. You can return your custom code also, but by default, framework will add 403 itself. You can even say any message you want to return to the user. Okay. So this, if we go back to health check, I've overridden authz at custom authz. Let's go back. Let me go to health check. Call this endpoint. If you see 403 forbidden message, custom access forbidden message. Now, if I want to simply allow this user to be passing the authorization, I can just go here. Custom auth I'll say success true. If success true is there, then code and message are actually redundant. These can even be commented out. And I have restarted the project. So this, I've overridden the authorization on a particular API endpoint. You can now do it for your project as well. Put any attribute-based and role-based access control mechanisms. Okay. So now comes to the shape of your data and validations. When you write an API, let's say user registration API, creating a new user, often you write validations within your UI components in React, Vue.js, whatever you're using to just check that user is putting in email properly with the right format. You check regular expressions and various dependency checks, so on and so forth in your front end. Then within your backend service also you put the same checks, correct? That email must be present, email must be of this format or regular expression. And sometimes there are even more complex checks that you do. Now, when you start coding these checks, how do you implement them? You add them as middleware. When you create express routes in ExpressJS, you start writing code there, right? In ExpressJS. For example, let me quickly search on Google, uh, or we have it in our blog itself of schema-driven development. Let me just show you how you do it when you do it typically with Express Server, okay? So this is how you do it typically. You have basically set up a schema file somewhere else. Sometimes developers don't even do that. And here we are using AJV validate or some other validator to define the user schema on every route. Now you see this is merged with my Express code. It is coupled. Tomorrow you want to reuse the same validation in GraphQL, you cannot. Okay. If you want to replace with Fastify, you will need to rewrite this again. Now further, when you couple it with your Express code, you cannot generate your Swagger spec automatically or your GraphQL schema automatically with these validations, right? These examples of different validations will not come in a Swagger spec. For example, when we in this name Godspeed, you are seeing this example out here. If you go to health check body, health check basically, and you check request body, I've put the example here, Godspeed, and hence it is coming there. So these things will not work for you. You'll need to manually create your Swagger, your Postman, your GraphQL schema, everything yourself. Okay, which is not only a extra time consuming job, it's a waste of your time, but also it increases the chances of errors. Because if you are following this approach, the typical approach you follow, then you have added already this particular validation out here, but you forgot to add it to Postman collection, this examples. Okay. And so then it will never be published, this particular thing. And you have to repeat your effort. And when you update your API also, you will have to again go and change your Postman and Swagger. So hence schema-driven development requests you or demands from you rather to define all your schemas in one place and generate everything else from that one schema like we do in Godspeed. You define your Swagger schema of your request body. Okay, out here, this is a Swagger schema. This is standard. It's out there on open. Even ChatGPT, any AI agent can generate it for you. It's available on Google everywhere. Just search, learn JSON schema, Swagger schema. Start putting your things here. This is your Postman collection in making. And as well, Godspeed will start validating your inputs based on this schema. So you define your request body as per Swagger, your responses as per Swagger, and also your params as per Swagger. For example, here, three things only you need to care about: body, responses, and params. Mm, params, responses, and body as applicable. For example, here I'm using ID. This param is here in the path. It's in path. This is Swagger spec. This is nothing to do with Godspeed. This is standard used across all tech companies of the world today. Swagger and JSON schema. So once you have defined your Swagger and JSON schema of your request, inputs, params, and responses, the framework will start checking two things. Number one, when you get an input, okay, it will start validating input against your defined schema following schema-driven development. When you return a response, it will even check that you as a microservice or API owner, are you returning the response you promised in your Swagger, which was automatically generated for you, right? In the last video we saw in docs folder, your Swagger is generated for you from your settings. You know? So all your JWT, bearer auth, all your events, whichever you have defined, your definitions are here as components and schemas. This is your basic Swagger info server. And let's go now to an event endpoint, right? You see fetch loan offers post, summary, description. Your tags are generated. Operation ID is automatically generated, but you can override that out here also. For example, out here, you could say operation ID. You could say tags. But this tag, I will suggest to not modify it. It will be automatically generated for you so that your Swagger output is organized in folders, no? You see, these are tags. And then once you specify operation ID and everything, the generated Swagger, and you expose your API, Godspeed even has a command line which will generate your client in Godspeed way to consume through Axios, your another Swagger spec. We will cover that in another video. But for now, you could set all of these things here. And the framework will start validating apart from the Swagger generated. Okay. Then let us go hit the health endpoint and see what happens. Now, as you remember, we had in the authorization, the custom auth we had overridden this, right? If you go to health check event, in the health check event, auth we had changed the custom auth to allow the endpoints to work, no? Here in this custom auth TypeScript, we have started returning success true. So now authorization error should not come. So we execute this API. Oof, it has given response validation, internal server error 500, response schema validation failed. The API execution was successful, but a failure in validating response body, okay, with status code 200. That means your API executed successfully. You tried to return status code 200, but instead it is expecting your schema of this event is expecting a string, but you returned a object. All right. So we need to simply return a string. And hence this is the error I got. Now this was response validation. Let us also look at request validation. If you go again to the event schema, let's go check this request and response validation. So you go to responses. I'm saying in 200, I'm saying application text and I will give a type string. This is what I promised, but I returned a JSON object. Hence I got the error. Now in input also in request, I'm saying input must be application JSON, the body, and the property, there must be a type name with type string, and example is Godspeed. So now we saw response schema validation error is failing. What about request? So here is the request body of the health point where we say that request must be body must be application JSON, the content, and it must have required property name, which is a type string. Example is Godspeed. So when the Swagger is generated for you, let's look at Swagger of this event. No slash health. It was a type post request. URL is slash health. So you have paths slash health, post request, summary and description. Summary and description. Same comes here. Your tag health underscore check has been generated for you. It is the name of this event itself. And in tags, any folders that your events are in, those folders will also be used as tags. Okay. So since this is at top level, only the name of file is coming as a tag. Operation ID has been automatically generated for you from the summary. If you had an operation ID here itself, this Swagger would also be get picked up in your project and that operation ID would come here. Okay. Then request body is same as your body here. This is request body, application JSON, type object, required name, same thing. Example, Godspeed has been generated for you, right? Since we disabled authentication, That particular thing is not here. All right. In other endpoint, you see security bearer auth is there, but here it was removed because we did auth and is false. So your Swagger has now been generated. Now, if we remove this name Godspeed from here, you see bad request 400. Request validation failed, required property name. So your validation of response and request is automatically working. If you want to change how your request responses look like, we had looked at request and response validation errors before, right? So here is your event sources. The default request and response validations were put there. Uh, you see request validation error, response validation error. So request validation error was request dot standard response. You can customize it using a TypeScript or a JavaScript function. So here is validations, standard response YAML or a TypeScript function. You could return anything. Here in the YAML, whenever there's a validation error, in your workflows, there's an inputs object, context.inputs. We will come to it later. Okay. How to consume a handler from an event. We will come to it later. But whatever are inputs from your event, it could be headers, query, params, body, and user information. Okay. Parsed from your JWT token or OAuth2 or wherever, whether from GraphQL server, Express server, all these plugins are required to set this in the inputs object. And whenever there's a validation error, framework will give a validation underscore error object also. Okay. In this particular workflow, this is what we are returning. It's a COM.js transform. Transform simply helps you transform data or create a new JSON every time. Here we are returning a new JS status. I'm saying success of this task is false. Code is 400. This is my data. Okay. Then this is what I'm seeing here. This is validation error object. Okay. You could return any custom validation error out here. Just change it, change your flow, use TypeScript code, whatever. Okay. In TypeScript, inputs has data object, which has validation underscore error. Okay. So you can now do whatever, have your custom request response validation errors. Now we saw that even my validations are being done by the framework itself, irrespective of the event source. The event source's job is to parse your input and create the standard object for inputs. And then validation of those inputs is done by the framework. Then when you send response, before returning the response to the event source plugin to send it to the client, the framework validates the response, okay, and checks whether it is a correct response. This is schema-driven development. One of the benefits is automatic validations, automatic creation of documentation. Now, with this documentation created Swagger spec, your automatic integration tests can be generated as well for all of these APIs because all your examples and your check conditions, everything is right here. So as a developer, you don't need to run around learning different middlewares, writing code in 100 places, and that to coupled code, right? Which is not a best practice within your Express, within your Fastify, within Apollo GraphQL. No, you don't need to do all of that. Just focus on writing schema in one place and use it everywhere. Okay. Even you could use these schemas which you have with some added notations to even create internal UI tools, which we have done in Elastic Graph, one of the projects, dev tools and ORM over Elasticsearch in Godspeed. Elastic Graph allows you to create even your admin UI to do CRUD over your database via just these annotations and schemas. So schema generates even your user interface along with your CRUD API, sorry, your validations, your authentication, authorization, your documentation Swagger, your GraphQL schemas, other schemas are generated from that. Plus your integration test case can be generated, plus even your UI can be generated, all from one schema. Okay, it reduces the effort and chances of error too. So coming back to events, validations have been covered, Swagger has been covered. Let's go to log. this one part that remains. So in log attributes, you put log attributes event type health check. See here, event type health check. So whenever this particular event is executed, it will be called the event type. Hmm. So this helps you debug that which event has executed. You can add your any log attributes out here. It will show in every log statement. This is a log statement saying this was an error. Okay. And here you see that this attributes are also showing up. So this is about event configurations in Godspeed. In this video, we checked how can we create events for different event sources. We saw that same event can be exposed via multiple event sources using ampersand. We saw that only the first line changes across this all event sources kind of events which we generate. For example, HTTP, GraphQL, Fastify, Express, Apollo, GraphQL support the same URI out here. Okay. Then secondly, um, Kafka supports different kind of URI. Similarly, Salesforce have its own kind of URI. When you will create a WebSocket kind of a plugin, you can create your own URI. It could be WebSocket dot, let's say your topic again, topic name. That's it. You are listening on this topic from WebSocket. Everything else is same, right? This is first thing. Then IDs and operation IDs can be added here. If you add either an ID or operation ID, it will come. If you do not add it, your summary will be used to generate the operation ID. Description and summary will be added in your Swagger. So we checked how your event definition combined with event source definition will create a Swagger spec. Using that same Swagger spec, how the framework via command line gen GraphQL schema will generate your GraphQL spec also. And then validations, your body validation, request body, your params, and your schema validations we studied will be automatically working. Then we also checked request validation error and response validation error. We also saw that you can customize default handling of event source within the event as well. For example, I'm customizing my validation errors handling for this particular event health check. So overriding the default setting for HTTP's validation handling, right? I can do that also. Then I can also customize authorization, and as well I can add custom log attributes whenever this event is run. These keys will be added in the log along with the event source keys. So this was about using events in Godspeed. Once you have configured events, all of them will start showing in your Swagger, is automatically generated along with your definitions folder, right? Which we have seen. You can create as many definitions again in JSON schema, standard format out here. And these definitions you could reuse in your events. Yes, one thing I forgot to tell you, you could reuse these definitions out here. Definitions LOS apply loan. Definitions LOS apply loan. Okay. You could start reusing these definitions. These will become components in your Swagger spec, is what we saw, right? So let me just show you once again. Components. These are your components which are generated for you. They will be put within components of your Swagger API as well, your Swagger schema. Here are all the components. All right, whatever you define in the definitions. So, and in this video, we also studied about schema-driven development and single source of truth. You can go ahead and read the blog out here as well on our official documentation. It's a wonderful blog which will explain you everything about this concept. There's even a video of schema-driven development, first guardrail. Go ahead and watch it and check it out yourself. So thank you very much, my friends, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found it useful. These were some of the best practices we went through in this video. And yes, feel free to shoot us your questions, ask any questions in Discord. Happy to have you over there. If you have any issues, feel free to message us on Discord, ask us a question, raise an issue on GitHub. Thank you for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.